Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's guest is the Washington Post's Max Boot. Max has a new book out, Reagan, His Life and Legend. I think Reagan is incredibly relevant to the themes of this podcast leading to the 2024 election for the following three reasons. Number one, the Reagan era of American politics is over. Successful political figures during realignments are able to define politics in their terms. Whether you like him, hate him, or think he's just whatever, Reagan defined the terms of American politics moving forward from the 1980s onward. So as we enter into a new political future defined by realignment today, understanding the way that Reagan's era and Reagan's issues and ideas are different than the present is absolutely key. Number two, Reagan fits into the overall spectrum of the leadership of the Republican Party. As the right debates its future, no matter what happens in November, understanding Reagan's position on ideas that are Trumpist, like immigration, to tax cuts, defense policy, et cetera, is absolutely key. Last but not least, you're going to see a bunch of folks moving forward, especially if Trump loses the 2024 election, who are going to argue we need to return to Reaganism. This is the Nikki Haley school of thought. There are plenty of people who see that Reagan's sunny, optimistic vision was actually capable of winning popular and electoral votes, something the modern Republican Party has not been able to do. So as you see these figures offer their visions for the Republican Party moving forward, understanding Reagan and his ideas is absolutely key. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Max Boot, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me.
First question that I normally in any other year would think would be a cheap shot, but actually is relevant when you're writing about Reagan, is how do you think Reagan would respond to Donald Trump from a 2024 election perspective? And I say cheap shot because it's annoying to sort of say, hey, like take this figure from history and put them in the present outside of context. But considering George H.W. Bush voted for Hillary, George W. Bush didn't vote for Trump, Dick Cheney's endorsing Kamala Harris, there's obviously like an interesting evolution when it comes to late 20th century conservative politicians here. So how do you think that dynamic applies to Reagan?
Well, I'm sure if Reagan were still alive, he'd be very puzzled by Donald Trump because their views and personalities are so divergent. I mean, remember, Reagan was a guy who was in favor of free trade, in favor of immigration, in favor of alliances, in favor of NATO, in favor of standing up to Russia. All these stances are very much at odds with where Donald Trump and the Republican Party are today. And I think from a larger perspective, I mean, Reagan was a very upbeat, cheery, optimistic guy who viewed America as a shining city on a hill, talked about morning in America, was a huge believer in America and would never go around talking about America as a failed nation or, you know, some of the other things that Trump says. And certainly Reagan would never engage in vitriol and in invective against his political adversaries. He was always very courtly, very gentlemanly, and had a much more low-key and friendly way of interacting, whether it was with political supporters or political opponents. I mean, for all those reasons, I'm sure that if Reagan were alive today, he would be written off like so many other Republicans as a rhino, as a Republican in name only, somebody who wasn't on board with MAGA Republicanism. But what would, you know, Reagan actually do if he were alive? Hard to say, because he had tremendous loyalty to the Republican Party as an institution, and he believed in something he called the 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. And I think, you know, while some prominent Republicans like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and others have come out against Trump, many others like George W. Bush are kind of holding their tongues. And, you know, Reagan would probably be very much in that category.
Something I'm curious about, and this is why I think, as you describe in the book, Reagan, for many biographers and just people in general, presents an enigma. So when you talk, for example, about Reagan wouldn't be in favor of Trump's trade agenda and trade approach, I think at a broad-based perspective, Reagan would never be a politician who'd be embracing broad-based tariffs across the entire American economy. But he was very targeted when it came to competing with Japanese industry, especially in the case of manufacturing and automobiles. So how should we understand these sort of, there's the idea of Ronald Reagan, but then when we zoom in on certain data points like industrial policies for Japan, it's complicated.
Well, no politician is ever going to be pure in any, ideological or policy sense. In the case of Japanese autos, which was the big issue in the 1980s with, a lot of people blaming Japanese imports for the problems that the American automobile industry was having. There was a huge push in Congress for tariffs on Japanese autos, and basically to head that off, Reagan asked the Japanese for quote-unquote voluntary import restrictions to limit the number of autos that they imported. But he was definitely very strongly opposed to tariffs. I mean, he was somebody who had actually been alive, when the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed, which made the Great Depression much worse than it otherwise would have been, which is, at least that's what most economists now say. And so he ardently believed because of his experience. I mean, you remember Reagan was part of the so-called greatest generation, the Great Depression, World War II generation. And so he ardently believed in free trade. He ardently believed in alliances. He ardently believed in America's leading role in the world, because the Great Depression and World War II told him the consequences of America pulling back from the world would be catastrophic. And that shaped his worldview pretty consistently, even though he, in midlife, moved from being a New Deal Democrat to being a conservative Republican. But his commitments on trade and on American international leadership, all those remain very much constant.
You get at this in the introduction when you write about how Reagan, despite being deeply ideological, he was an eminently practical politician. There's a streak of pragmatism to him, but I think is embodied in your articulation of how, if Congress is going to be passing legislation when it comes to Japan, and there's this clear, popular rising tide, he's going to come to his own solution. Talk about how he balances ideology, deep ideology, with pragmatism, because I find that very admirable. Regardless of whether or not whether you agree or disagree with his policy stands, I think it's a key skill set that a politician needs to cultivate.
Absolutely. And I think this was really the secret of his success, kind of his paradoxical nature, that he could be both very intensely ideological, but also very, very pragmatic. And so he tended to be very ideological on the campaign trail or as an after-dinner speaker. And, as I show in the book, by the early 1960s, he had moved very far to the right from his earlier New Deal Democratic allegiance. I mean, he was somebody who was spouting conspiracy theories about how Democrats were leading America towards socialism or even communism. He was denouncing the passage of Medicare and Medicaid as socialized medicine and warning this would lead to the complete extinction of freedom in America. He was also, by the way, opposed to civil rights legislation, and again warning that this would be this horrible intrusion on private property rights that would lead to totalitarianism in America. So for all those reasons, he thrilled a lot of people on the right and scared a lot of people in the center and the left who thought he would be some kind of right-wing lunatic coming to office. But he radically upended those expectations when he became governor, when he was elected governor of California in 1966, and again when he was elected president of the United States in 1980. In both positions, he revealed a very deep streak of pragmatism and a willingness to compromise. In fact, he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want and come back some more the next day than to demand everything right now. And he had nothing but contempt for conservatives who go over the cliff with their flags flying. That was a term that he often used. And if you look at his record, as I do in the book, you see that he was frequently compromising with Democrats in both Sacramento and in Washington. I mean, he certainly believed in lower taxes, but he wound up raising taxes more often than he cut them. And he certainly believed in opposition to abortion. He believed in a pro-life stance, but as governor of California, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. As president, I would add, he signed a bill in 1986 that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants, what folks on the right today would call an amnesty bill. And, his crowning achievement in his second term in office was working with Mikhail Gorbachev, the world's #1 communist, to peacefully end the Cold War, which is pretty much the last thing anybody would have expected from somebody like Ronald Reagan, who throughout his political life had been defined by his staunch anti-communism. And yet here he was able to see that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader and to work with him to reduce tensions between our two countries. So that's the ultimate tribute to his pragmatism.
Something I'm curious about, reading about the period, because especially for younger listeners born in the late 90s and 2000s, key difference in the way we conceived our political system was, at the time, it was a given that Democrats would control the House. Republicans controlled the presidency with these huge landslides, Reagan, Nixon, George H.W. Bush, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Democrats just held the House since the late 1950s. How much of Reagan's pragmatism then was just forced on him versus, let's say, it's the 2000s or 2010s or 2020s, and it's conceivable that his more right-leaning ideology could control the House, the Senate, and the presidency together? Would he have behaved differently in those circumstances?
Quite possibly, but, as both governor and as president, he had to deal with Democrats because in his 16 years as governor and as president, there were only 2 years in which Republicans controlled both chambers, and that was in California from 68 to 70 when Republicans had both the Assembly and the state Senate. So that was a very rare occasion. So he had to compromise, but, he was successful in compromising in part because political parties in those days were also much more varied than they are today. Today, like pretty much everybody who's a right-winger is in the Republican Party, everybody who's on the left is in the Democratic Party, whereas back when Reagan was governor and president, both parties had liberal and conservative wings. So people forget this, that there were liberal Republicans, but there were also conservative Democrats. So there had to be much more bipartisan cooperation, but there was also much more ability to compromise across partisan lines because the parties are much more varied in their ideologies than they have since become when they've become much more polarized. And so, he couldn't have passed his economic agenda, for example, in 1981 without the support of conservative Democrats known as boll weevils. And, pretty much almost all those boll weevils have disappeared. They've all pretty much become Republicans. But likewise, he had trouble selling his agenda to a lot of liberal Republicans who thought he was going to be, boosting taxes or boosting the budget deficit too much, and he was being irresponsible. And so it was just, a very different American. I think probably a better place because there was the ability for much more bipartisan compromise than what you see today.
It's kind of when I always think about when people give that anecdote you just gave, which is that it's the ultimate political science, be careful what you wish for. Because in the 1950s, when political scientists look at how you had Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats who were taking opposite positions on civil rights. But then there's Western, more libertarian Republicans, such as Barry Goldwater. They thought this was a bad thing, and that if we had systems that were more polarized, the liberals in the Liberal Party, conservatives in the conservative parties, this would lead to a better governing system and approach for the country. But it's actually been the total opposite. So it's just like a really interesting, careful what you wish for style situation.
Yeah. I think what actually might make for a better governing for the country is if we had more than two parties, because then you could have, greater variety of choice. But I think what happens when you have two parties is very often it's the extremes in the two parties that kind of dominate the system because they basically threaten incumbents in the primary system and force incumbents to go to the left or to the right. It doesn't necessarily produce centrist government.
You're a political independent now, so this is a good question to ask you. Here's what I just always wondered about the idea that more parties would reduce polarization and sort of make things better. At the end of the day, though, let's say you had 3, 4, 5, 6 parties, they would still sort of coalition together, right? So there definitely would be. Oh, so here's a question for you. I'm curious, let's say that we have a fairy wand. What would the Max Boot party look like? What is its organizing principle? What's the perspective? Because it has to be more than just independence. Because that's why those movements, the reason why things like no labels and pure independence don't actually work is that you need to have some sort of organizing standard beyond just sort of, we don't like these two things that exist.
Yeah. I have, pretty centrist views where, very broadly, I would characterize myself as pretty liberal on social issues, very much a believer in strong defense and American international leadership when it comes to foreign policy. And, truly truly down the middle, I would say probably an economic policy because, I do worry about budget deficits, but I also do think that government has an important role to play in areas, whether it's infrastructure or, dealing with massive recessions and so forth. So there's not, I would say, there's elements of both parties that kind of line up with what I believe in, but not necessarily one party as a whole, but that's okay. I mean, I'm totally fine with being independent. I feel like I was part of the Republican Party for a long time, and I feel like that enforces a certain conformity of thought on you, which I'm very happy to leave behind. And I think, in the case of this Reagan biography, for example, I think it really benefited from the fact that I left the Republican Party and became an independent, because if I was writing this book from the perspective of a committed Republican or a committed Reagan fan, I don't think it would be as good of a book. It would be like so many other books that are just hagiography, and that's not something that I set out to do. I really wanted to be objective and balanced and show both the good and bad of Reagan. I think I was enabled to do that because I kind of don't have a partisan dog in this hunt anymore.
Something I'm curious about, then I want to get back to the Reagan biography. I would really love to hear, the show is called The Realignment. I would like to hear your thoughts on the realignment of perspectives on foreign policy, because I work at the Hudson Institute, so I speak to a lot of sort of like center right to conservative forces who think like, okay, Joe Biden is weak, Kamala Harris is weak. We could sort of see this path where Trump makes this work out for us. But sort of my operating thesis from a political action perspective is that we are just going to see in general, like a hawkish side of the Democratic Party reemerge. I think especially the perfect example of this was like the TikTok issue. The Democratic Party actually changed its mind on TikTok and Trump has like pivoted back. So I just think that conservative Republican hawks are making a dangerous gamble with like sort of wishing things to be not what they are. I'd be curious what your perspective on like where hawks end up during a party realignment.
Well, I'm not sure how hawks can wind up backing Trump when he is, kind of missing in action in arguably the most important foreign policy issue we face right now, which is Ukraine. I mean, in the last debate, he was asked whether he wants Ukraine to win their war with Russia, and he didn't say yes. He said he wants the war to end, which suggests that he doesn't necessarily want Ukraine to win. And I think that's really the defining issue of our time. It's impossible for me to imagine Ronald Reagan being agnostic as to whether he wants the victims of Russian imperialism to prevail or not. And so I think it's very disheartening to see the leader of the Republican Party today, basically taking such a weak position on Putin, which is why I think you just recently had a whole bunch of veteran Republican national security and foreign policy officials who are endorsing Kamala Harris, not necessarily because they're huge fans of Kamala Harris, but because they're very much afraid of what Trump would do in office.
Something I'd be curious, since you're a writer, journalist, biographer, you're not, let me put it this way, when you write these books, you're not auditioning for administration jobs, and you're not trying to launch a new think tank. So you have a degree of flexibility here. I'd be curious, as you look at those Republican foreign policy professionals who are endorsing Kamala Harris, do you think it's a better move for them to just become, let me say tactically, let's put aside morals for a second if you don't want to go there. Is it a smarter tactical move for them to just sort of like embrace a Democratic Party that's interested or open to more hawkish arguments or are open to the framing of authoritarianism versus democracy versus trying to sort of say, look, this Trump thing is eventually going to pass. If we make that move, if we go too early, we'll have no credibility. And these sort of up in the air people, especially the rising 40 and 50 somethings who are going to lead the party next, won't listen to us when there's time to build a new party. How do you think about the dilemma faced by national security professionals on the right?
Really hard to say. I mean, that's a very complicated question to which everybody's going to have a different answer. I mean, I'm somebody who re-registered as an independent the day after Trump won office in 2016 because I just thought that this meant that Trump was going to be dominating the Republican Party, which in fact he has been doing. But, I was happy to see folks that I know and admire like Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster and others serving in the Trump administration because I think they were kind of the adults in the room. They were a useful balancing force against Trump's more extreme impulses. I'm just not sure that a lot of those folks will be let into the room in the next administration. Trump is not going to want to be surrounded by the adults in the room. But I mean, so many of the moderates that I know have left the Republican Party. A few have stayed in thinking like they still want to change it long term. And I think, either outlook is perfectly defensible.
So back to the book, here's the number one question I've wanted to get your perspective on, because to your point, you're not writing a hagiography. You're trying to reckon with Reagan, decades after his presidency. So this podcast is supported by the Hewlett Foundation's Economy and Society program, which means that I'm technically supported because I believe something like the following. The election of Ronald Reagan, especially coinciding with Margaret Thatcher's election in the UK, meant that the New Deal era came to an end, and we entered into a period which could broadly be described as neoliberal. Sometimes that gets a little annoying and academic, but broadly based speaking, and this is to the listeners, markets, reducing the size of government, where can the private sector fit in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The way that scholars who work in Hewlett Foundation and other, foundations worlds, they say is that if we look at what happened over the next 40 years, 2008 financial crisis, lack of COVID state capacity, trade disruption when it came to China, all of that could be placed not just literally at the feet of Ronald Reagan, but at the feet of the intellectual era that he inaugurated. I would love to hear what you think when you hear that sort of critique of Reagan and the role that he played in setting the political table for the next 40 years. And the same way the FDR's New Deal also set the table for the next 40 years.
Well, there's no question that the Reagan presidency had a lot of consequences, and a lot of those are unforeseen and unintended. I mean, I think Reagan's desire was to, lower taxes and return the nation to more robust economic growth, which you can argue to some extent that he achieved. But I think there are also, unforeseen consequences, like, for example, the widening of income inequality. And if you look at charts of income inequality, they diverge very rapidly and dramatically beginning in the early 1980s. And again, not all of that is Reagan's doing. Part of it is also deindustrialization, the coming of the information economy. There are a lot of, economic developments that were happening beginning in the 70s and 80s. But Reagan's policies probably contributed to some of that by, because his tax cuts advantaged upper income taxpayers much more so than anybody else. His anti-union agenda, decreased the power of unions. He relaxed the antitrust enforcement, allowed a lot of companies to merge and form. And of course, he had a very deregulatory agenda, which was largely bipartisan at the time, but deregulated the financial industry, for example, and caused a lot of problems, like a lot of, S&Ls went out of business and had to be bailed out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. I think the long-term consequence of some of those policies has been pretty concerning because, Reagan did not really focus on income inequality. He focused on creating opportunity rather than, creating equality of outcome. But because we have such great income inequality, I think it's been very destabilizing for our political system. It's really led to the rise of populism on both the left and the right. You had the Bernie Sanders, Occupy Wall Street type movement. Then you had the Tea Party, and now now Donald Trump on the right. And it's led to a loss of faith in government and, kind of a hollowing out of the middle class. I think these are all long-term dangerous developments for our economy and for our democracy.
Something I'm curious about then is another way of articulating what you just articulated. And this is sort of like the moderate response to Reagan, which is, look, the reason why the New Deal era ran out of steam wasn't just the fact that there were a bunch of conservative foundations who supported conservative intellectuals who advanced new sets of ideas. It was actually that at the end of the day, a 1932 to 1952 policy playbook ran out of juice. It wasn't an answer to the problems of the time. It didn't present the same dynamics and opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think members of the GOP or people who are just conservatives in general who try to use the positives of Reagan to sort of argue for a different face of the Republican Party, how do they reconcile that? Because to a certain point, I don't think it's easy just to say America's problem is that our taxes are too high. it's now a little easier on a couple levels to talk about inflation, but if the year is 2016 or if the year is 2020, trying to bring up inflationary politics when it comes to debt and deficit spending isn't going to be a thing the voters were interested in. So how do you balance the fact that Reagan presents a model for a successful conservative movement that could actually unironically win governing majorities, but also doesn't quite resonate with anyone born after the 1970s?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see, ideological and political waves in this country, and certainly from the 1930s on, you kind of had the pro-government wave, the notion that obviously, which was very compelling during the Great Depression, that government needs to step in and help people deal with all these problems, and the creation of a welfare state, which culminated in the Great Society programs in the 1960s. And then you saw kind of a pullback from that, where the country still had a lot of problems, including crime and, obviously a lot of economic stagnation in the 1970s, high inflation, the gas crisis and so forth. And people, recoiled from that and kind of blamed government for a lot of those problems. And so they across the Western world, whether it was in the UK, the US, wherever, there was a great openness to more free market oriented approaches. That's why Margaret Thatcher came in. That's why Ronald Reagan came in. And, I think that had a great appeal and a great utility. But, when Reagan came in, the top income tax rate was, like 70%. So he was lowering it very considerably from the top rates to a top rate of something like 30% or something like that, 25%. So that was a huge change. But I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of Republicans who have looked at the Reagan legacy and said, oh, well, the secret to political success is we always just need to be cutting taxes. But, what really matters is the level that you're starting from with tax cuts. And, if you're starting at a low level of taxation already, further tax cuts are not necessarily going to have a big impact to boost the economy. And it might make it difficult for the government to address major problems. I think we've actually, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what era we're in because we're still in the middle of it. But, I would say we've kind of moved into the post-Reagan era where I think both parties have shown that they're much more comfortable with big government than Ronald Reagan was. Donald Trump had the biggest deficit spending of all time, the biggest budget deficits of all time. And people in the Republican Party don't really seem to care about that. And Joe Biden, in turn, remember when Bill Clinton was president in the 1990s, he said the era of big government is over because he was still so influenced by Reagan. But the era of big government has returned with Joe Biden, with these massive infrastructure bill or massive COVID relief bills. And people in the Democratic Party are very comfortable with that. So I think, we've moved into the post-Reagan era where tax cuts are no longer seen as the answer to everything, although Trump still advocates tax cuts. But I think there is an openness to different approaches and different solutions now.
And now, a quick word about the A16Z podcast. Hey, it's Marshall. In an exponential era, it's more important than ever for our country to have alignment between policymakers, founders, and funders. However, it's rare that we find them all in the same room. That's where the A16Z podcast from Andreessen Horowitz comes in. They bring together guests like the very first CTO of the CIA and the chief security officers behind OpenAI, Anthropic, and DeepMind to cover topics like intelligence in the era of AI, the nuclear renaissance, the future of defense, and much more in the world of American dynamism, the term coined by A16Z general partner and friend of the Realignment, Catherine Boyle. The A16Z podcast's episodes also tackle other important trends in technology and business, from supply chains to space and beyond. Want to know more about the $3 billion record Social Security breach? They've got you covered. Wondering if tech can finally disrupt the healthcare industry? They recently broke this down. Curious about governing democracy, corporate boards, and the internet? Listen in to find out. Eavesdrop on the future with the A16Z podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. If you're following Democratic Party politics, especially before Biden dropped out, obviously this wasn't just sort of telegraphed, this was explicitly stated in various outlets like The Atlantic, the Biden folks, with Biden especially, saw themselves as trying to be the Democratic versions of Ronald Reagan. Not ideologically, but like Bidenomics was very explicitly making a Morning in America play. And after they came out of the 2022 midterms, the hope was they would be able to air their own. I think we would have seen like a literal, like very clearly homage to Morning in America ad from the Biden campaign, like this August, saying things are really tough, things are really bad, but we could see that manufacturing is coming back and we could see the inequalities falling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you think at a political level, because they still kind of had some of the metrics they could point to suggest the Morning in America argument would be real. Why at a political level, now that you've written about Reagan specifically, do you think Joe Biden just could never stick that landing at a political narrative level?
That's a great question to which I don't have a great answer. I mean, if you look at it objectively, as you suggested, a lot of the metrics today are actually better than they were in 1984 when Reagan was running on a Morning in America re-election campaign. The unemployment rate and the inflation rate are both lower today than they were in 1984. Economic growth is not quite as high because there was a temporary spike in economic growth in 1984 to 7.2%. It's not that high today, but you know, it's certainly the case that economic growth in the U.S. outpaces that in any other major industrialized democracy. So, you know, objectively speaking, you would think that Biden would have a pretty good record to point to, and Kamala Harris could run on the Biden-Harris record. But people just don't see it that way. People have a very sour view of the economy. You could argue about why that is. Part of it could be just because, you know, several years of inflation has just raised prices, even though the inflation rate is pretty low right now, but it still had a cumulative impact over several years. You can just argue that it's, you know, kind of just maybe perhaps a more polarized partisan environment where people just don't have a shared picture of the situation as they might have done in 1984. But whatever the reason, there is kind of a sense that I would say there's the kind of the public's negative view of the economy is somewhat disconnected from a lot of the positive economic indicators, although I think there has been some evidence in the last few months that public perceptions are turning more positive,
which were all perfectly timed with Joe Biden dropping out. So there's just a real serious, and once again, it's neither here nor there because he's left the race now. But I think at a pure like political science question level, it's a very fascinating thing to think about. Here is something I'd really like to hear. So I'd love for you to talk about Ronald Reagan's connection between his success in Hollywood and his success as a politician. Because to give some context real quick, I'm always fascinated as a person who works in academia and think tank world. So I'm very like, I'm reading the books, I'm like doing wonky things. The objective of this show isn't to get like 1 trillion views. It's to say like, hey, let's do like a really smart conversation where I actually read the book. But in the back of my mind, I'm always hearing from folks who say things like, well, look at Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast has huge numbers. He's huge numbers, crazy high name recognition. Look at Jake and Logan Paul. They're getting increasingly political.
And I now know who Mr. Beast is because my teenage kids told me.
Which is exactly what people say would happen. So there's this like very articulated, serious theory, which is like, hey, like in the future, these future political actors are going to be these viral podcasters, YouTube stars, et cetera. But the reason why I tie this back to the Reagan question is my riposte to that is always, well, one could have said a similar story about Hollywood. But Shirley Temple tries to run for Congress a bunch of times and never gets elected. So I would just posit that the skill set for a politician is not quite the same thing as a skill set for a starlet or a star. And actually, if it were just true that all that matters in politics is how famous are you, we wouldn't just say, well, there's Arnold Schwarzenegger and there's Ronald Reagan and there's so talk about this. Like,
George Clooney is not running for president, right?
George Clooney is not running for president. So like what was it about Reagan's? But you write this, like his ability as an actor were clearly tied to his political success. What makes him uniquely able to exploit this opportunity that no one else? And he wasn't even that great of an actor. Let's be frank here too, right? Like, how does this work? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I would say, acting ability or communications ability is necessary to be a successful politician, but it's not necessarily sufficient. And clearly, Reagan's mastery of various communications medium, whether it was radio, movies, or television, and he was a star in all three of those, was very important to his political rise and his political success. I mean, he was once asked how an actor could be president, and his reply was he didn't understand how anybody but an actor could be president because you had to spend so much time communicating, and he did it so masterfully. But there was a lot more to him than that, and people who said, "Oh, this is just an actor reading lines," greatly underestimated him and were shocked by his success as a politician. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he was really deeply immersed in the issues. And, he was somebody who was a very voracious reader. Now, he wasn't always reading the most credible news sources. He tended to read things like Reader's Digest and Human Events, and he would often believe their wilder and more apocryphal claims and repeat them. But nevertheless, he was really immersed in the nitty-gritty of ideology and policy. And, he was very interested in what was going on. And, later on when he was president, people would say, "Oh, he's just a guy reading a teleprompter and other people are writing the speeches." And that was to a large extent true because no president anymore really writes their own speeches. But Reagan was writing his own speeches for decades before that, like in the 1950s, when he was really learning the trade of politics, working as a spokesman for General Electric, when he was host of General Electric Theater, one of the top-rated TV shows in the country, beamed into every household in America on Sunday nights. But he was also going around to GE factories and office floors and civic organizations and giving basically what were stump speeches. And GE was a pretty political company, so they were happy with him, not just talking about a great company GE is, but also talking about the state of America, talking about the state of the world, because GE wanted to promulgate kind of a conservative worldview. And so, he would write down on his index cards things that he read or heard, points to make, and he would shuffle his index cards before every speech and give a different speech each time. And then he was also very good at judging the audience reaction. And so index cards that resonated stayed in the pile. The ones that didn't resonate, they went in the trash can. And so he really honed his speech-making ability with no help whatsoever. It was all him. In fact, Stu Spencer, his longtime political consultant going back to 1966, Stu told me that Reagan was the best speechwriter he ever met, not just speech giver, but best speech writer, because he understood how to talk in a way that people could understand who were listening. He didn't write for the eye, he wrote for the ear. And that was something he had learned going back to his job as a Midwestern sportscaster in his 1920s during the Great Depression. And so he understood how to communicate in a very pithy way. And that was an essential skill set. But it wasn't just, the ability to read the message. It was also the ability to shape the message and to, boil the message down to essentials that people could understand. That was so important. And somebody who's just reading lines in a movie doesn't necessarily know how to do that.
So an immediate reaction that the celebrity brand managers who are increasingly politicized should be thinking about here is the way you told that story. And this is why, when I was a kid, I grew up in a very liberal Oregon household, and whenever the crap would be talked about Reagan, it'd be like, oh, once again, it's just an actor. But reducing him to an actor undercounts. He's testifying before the House Un-American Affairs Committee. He's a union organizer within Hollywood, right? So we're not talking about the coal mines, but there's still a political skill set here. He is launching multiple runs for the presidency. He's governor of California. He's doing these travels across the country for GE. I think if we also look to Arnold Schwarzenegger, another political, he was speaking at the Republican National Convention in the 80s and the 90s. He didn't just wake up one day in the year 2002 and say, I'm going to be a governor. And I think what tends to happen with too many of these stars who are interested in politics, no offense, Shirley Temple, is they kind of miss the decades of prep you needed to actually engage, then be successful. So that would be the differentiator.
It's not just Hollywood stars. It's also rich people in general. There's a lot of rich people who run for political office, but haven't really done the preparation work to be successful at it.
Even, and look, once again, like this is not a podcast that praises Donald Trump, but even Donald Trump fits this theory, right? He's talking about maybe running in 1987. He is talking about running in 2000. Like, obviously people sort of treat that as like he's just flirting with it, but like that showed basically there hasn't been anyone who's been able to do Williams Jennings Bryan would be the only person that comes to mind who could just do a cold start of, I'm just going to show up and now this is my thing. And I think people just really miss that because they're distracted by the view counts and the dollars. Here's a quick question that goes from what you just said. There are a bunch of like congressional speechwriters and White House people who listen to this show, so give them some advice here. You had this great line in the book that I wanted to ask you about. You said, quote, I audible book things, so the quotes aren't exact. Directional quote, what people don't understand, basically this is the takeaway. You said that like people didn't think of Reagan as a great writer, but that's because when they looked at his writing, they didn't understand that, as you said, it was meant to be heard rather than just like putting this together into a book or a pamphlet and reading. As a writer yourself, can you just go a little deeper and explain the difference between writing, which is meant to be read, and writing that's meant to be heard?
Well, I think, one obvious difference is that, Reagan's, like, for example, his radio scripts were his radio talks in the 1970s. If you read those, they're very punchy. The sentences are very short, and they're very action-oriented. There's not a lot of description in there. People like me who are professional writers, we tend to be a little bit more windy and verbose and have longer sentences that kind of, that incorporate more elements. Whereas when you're speaking on radio, for example, you're doing just a hit of a few minutes, there's very little time to say anything. It has to be very spare. It has to communicate the meaning, and that's it. You can't have a lot of extraneous stuff. And he really figured out, he was really a genius, I think, at boiling his message down to the essentials, because so many people get kind of lost in the details and get lost in extraneous materials, whereas he was able, and this is truly one of his great skill sets, was he was able to drill down and understand what was most important in an issue and how to communicate that to people. And he wasn't delivering policy lectures, he wasn't going into great detail. And I think one of the criticisms of him, which is fair, is that he didn't know a lot of the details. He didn't have a lot of policy depth. And I think that's very true. And that was often problematic when he was dealing with conflicting advice that he often had trouble sorting out when he was in office, especially on issues like, the Middle East, where he didn't have a lot of knowledge or background, and so didn't really know what to do. But on the issues that he cared about, he had very fixed views, and he had great talent in communicating those views. And I would add, by the way, one of the pleasures of doing this biography and researching it over the course of the last decade was reading all of Reagan's letters, which were often, in fact, invariably beautifully written. He was a master not just of oral communications, but also of letter writing. He was very, very good at saying exactly the right thing to every single correspondent, striking the exact right note, whether it was sympathy or amusement or anger, whatever. He communicated it all beautifully. Whereas I would add his books, his memoirs. He wrote 2 memoirs that were actually both ghostwritten. This really, really not a good read, not fun, not interesting. Because he had no interest in those things. And so he just turned it over to ghostwriters and they did their thing, but it just wasn't really Ronald Reagan.
Here's something I'm curious about too. I think thinking seriously about Reagan, FDR, et cetera, I think brings to mind like thoughts about the question, to put it crassly, how brilliant or smart, quote unquote, does one need to be to actually be president? Because I think as someone who's obsessed with this, the further I go into this topic area, the more and more I'm convinced that there's just absolutely no correlation between how conventionally smart one is and a successful presidency. Herbert Hoover is incredibly smart, incredibly talented up until he becomes actually president. And something I'm just sort of curious about is like, how do you think of, because this is also something I would hear growing up, like Reagan was a dunce. Mondale's smarter than Reagan. Jimmy Carter's smarter than Reagan. It's this indictment of the American people that we just didn't choose the smarter person. But, Same thing comes true to, President George W. Bush, like who's made a bunch of different various policy mistakes, but I'm not quite sure how much those mistakes came down to being smart or not, quote unquote. Right, guys, there are plenty of smart people who supported those same policy decisions who could have been far more eloquent when it came to articulating them. So how do you just think about the general topic of intelligence and smarts when it comes to presidents?
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm reminded of a comment, probably apocryphal, that was made about FDR, that Roosevelt had a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. And as I write in the book, I think pretty much the same thing could be said about Ronald Reagan. Nobody would claim that Reagan was a genius or an intellectual, but he had a wonderful temperament, just as FDR did. In both cases, both men had kind of a winning optimism and charm and ability to communicate. And in both cases, they, relied heavily on advisors and for a lot of the substance of their policies, and the substance often changed in part based on the advisors. So I think obviously you need a baseline of intelligence to be a successful president, but you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be the smartest person ever to be president. In fact, you can have, as you said, you can have very smart people who are not great presidents because, being president is not, it's not like an IQ test. There's a lot of other skill sets involved, right? And you have to have like the basic IQ level to understand the issues, but then most of what makes you a success or failure has nothing to do with that. A lot of it is like emotional intelligence, your ability to communicate, your ability to lead people, to judge aides, to all these, to inspire people. So much of it has nothing to do with intelligence. And I would say both FDR and Reagan were truly gifted in areas outside of intelligence, but both of them were certainly smart enough to do the job of president, as their record showed.
So last two big questions here. We haven't talked about the Cold War and the emerging consensus that we are in something resembling a second Cold War, which in the sense that history rhymes never perfectly repeats. I don't want to get into a Cold War II or not fight. That's a whole different other episode. But that said, as many people conceive of Reagan as the person who led America into the end of the Cold War, what lessons and myths are relevant to our emerging great power competition area, to use the other euphemism or cliche to describe this space? Like, what lessons can and can we not take from Reagan's presidency?
Well, I see a lot of people, especially on the right, basically saying that we should use Reagan's Cold War playbook against the Soviet Union, use that with China today, and on the assumption that Reagan had this plan to win the Cold War and bring down the Soviet Union, we should be doing the same thing with China today, win our competition with China. I think that's actually very bad advice, very dangerous advice, which is based on a historical myth. I mean, in fact, I asked George Shultz, Reagan's Secretary of State, I said, did you have a plan to win the Cold War and bring down the Soviet Union? And he said, no, I wish we did, but we didn't. We just had a general attitude of peace through strength. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, Reagan certainly did a lot of things in his first term that ratcheted up pressure on the Soviet Union. For example, the defense buildup or announcing his missile defense initiative or providing aid to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But he also did things that relaxed pressure on the Soviet Union. For example, one of his first actions in office was to lift the grain embargo on the Soviet Union that Carter had imposed after the invasion of Afghanistan. So, I think it's just incorrect to say that he had this very consistent, tough, hardline position. In fact, I mean, he did do a lot of tough things like calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, but he also hoped to negotiate and meet with its leaders. And he was just stymied in his first term because, as he said, Soviet leaders kept dying on me. Things only really changed, and his policy of the Soviet Union only really became a success in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader. He was a black swan, somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system, but lost faith in the dictatorship and wanted to really reform it and liberalize it and make life better for ordinary Soviet citizens. Now, Reagan did not cause Gorbachev to come to power. He did not force the Gorbachev reforms. The Soviet Union was far from bankrupt in the mid-1980s, and Gorbachev was not driven to reform because he thought that the Soviet Union was losing an arms race with the United States. He wanted to end the arms race altogether because he thought the whole thing was dangerous and a waste of time and money. But I think it's very much to Reagan's credit that he recognized that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody he could do business with, which was very much counter to the advice he was getting from a lot of conservatives, like his own defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who was saying, you can't trust this guy. But Reagan met with Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985 and came away convinced that Gorbachev was a genuine reformer and he should support him, and he did. So I think that was a wonderfully pragmatic move, which we need to keep in mind as we think about China policy today, because it would be a big mistake just to look at Reagan's first term hardline agenda as being a template for China policy today, because in fact, the consequence of just ratcheting up tensions willy-nilly with China could make war much more likely, as in fact, war became more likely with the Soviet Union in 1983, and we had some real war scares. That's something we want to avoid with China today. Let's remember that Reagan's approach would only work if there were a genuine reformer in charge of China today, which is certainly not the case. Xi Jinping is more like Leonid Brezhnev, one of these hardliners that Reagan dealt with in his first term as president. So, I think we certainly should have a firm policy with China while also engaging in talks, but we shouldn't have any kind of illusions that we're going to, quote unquote, win the competition with China. I'm not even sure what that would mean, or, bring down the Chinese Communist Party. That's not going to happen. Only the Chinese can do that. And remember, China is even more powerful in many ways economically than the Soviet Union was, because China is now the world's number 2 economy, and it's not. The Soviet Union was far weaker. So I think we need to be very careful about applying these lessons from Reagan to China today, as so many people are trying to do.
So for the final question here, we're going to take a total left field, and something I've wanted to ask you for a while, actually. So I work.
Where did all my hair go?
Yeah, that's just this is a problem as I've entered into my 30s. I'm just aware of the uncomfortable answer to. I too may have to be wearing hats in public at some point. So something I'm curious about. So the first book of yours that I actually read, I'll put this up for the YouTube viewers, was Invisible Armies. An epic history of guerrilla warfare from ancient times to the present, that really emerged out of, I think, the 2000s and your work with the Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars, and the Rise of American Power. And because a lot of my foreign policy work from a day job perspective focuses on defense technology and great power competition, I have just noticed that we've had a weird pendulum swing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So back during the surge, the conventional wisdom was, wow, when we saw the 1990s and the 2000s, the Pentagon especially took its eye off the ball and didn't focus on insurgency. We weren't ready for post-conflict stability operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had no conception of this. The army wasn't right-sized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to focus on the actual problem that we're facing now. Now, though, in the year 2024, when we've moved on, rhetorically at least, from Iraq and Afghanistan, I read all these defense technology books that all say the following sentence, which is the total inverse of the implicit point of a lot of your work in the 2000s and 2010s, which is, well, we were focused on insurgencies and we were focused on the Middle East and Iraq and Afghanistan. China was focused on great power competition. China was focused on force structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, my takeaway as a person who surveys both of these spaces is that we quite literally never get it right. So like when we're fighting the war that we're fighting, we're going to focus on insurgency, and then we're going to sort of put the great power competition tech reform stuff to the side. What does it look like from your perspective? You've also written, I haven't read this book, but your book about armies and technology, you've written about technological adaptation in warfare. How do we at least get to the best possible version of balancing technology, reform, the future, but also, hey, people are dying because of IEDs. I'm sorry, we're not going to have the DoD spend all of its time thinking about drones. How do we balance these factors together? I'm fascinated by this.
Well, it's very hard to do. I mean, I think you have to be, a country like the United States has to be a full spectrum superpower, that we don't have the luxury of only focusing on one threat or one capability, because I think our national interest requires us to do a little bit of everything. Other countries are very different. I mean, other countries have, much more narrow security concerns. I mean, like Taiwan only has one security concern, that they're going to be attacked by China, right? So they don't have to worry about anything else. But we have to worry about a lot of things, including a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan. But we have to be worried also about a North Korean attack on South Korea. We have to be worried about a Russian attack on Western Europe. We have to be worried about a war in the Middle East. And we need to be worried about, nuclear proliferation in Iran or other countries. We need to be worried about terrorist groups. And these threats, just because you're focused on one threat doesn't mean the other ones go away. So I think you have to keep capabilities across the spectrum, but you have to balance those based on the current threats. And obviously, in the immediate post-Cold War years, for the few decades that followed, there wasn't a huge risk of great power conflict. And so we naturally tended to focus on, lower intensity missions and wound up obviously becoming very engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, of course, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that signaled a new era of great power competition, and obviously with the emergence of China as well as a near-peer rival. So we have to be, I do think that we have to devote the bulk of our resources to preparing for those kinds of conflicts, because those are potentially the most catastrophic and costly, but we can't entirely take our eye off the ball on other types of conflicts as well. And I note, for example, as I did in a recent column, that sadly, Islamic State is rising again, not only in Iraq and Syria, but as far afield as Afghanistan and Africa. And that, that doesn't require, we don't have to have, multiple army divisions focused on Islamic State, but you certainly need to have at least a small number of special operators and advisors and people working with local allies to try to keep those kinds of threats in check. So, you have to do a little bit of everything, which is why we wind up spending so much on our military, approaching a military budget, defense budget of $1 trillion, which is much larger than anybody else. But it's also the case that we have much greater interests and responsibilities than anybody else.
Yeah, and frankly, I will just say that as someone who is sympathetic to audience and populist skepticism of the defense budget, I do like the way you articulated the order, though. You started with, hey, here are the specific missions we're engaged with overseas and the objectives we have. Like, let's not have a nuclear war in South Korea. Let's not have the Poles develop a nuclear weapon because they're not confident in our ability to backstop them against Russia. We also worry about the Islamic State, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you start with those objectives, which I see most people not really having specific objections to. And then we talk about then this costs $1 trillion under our current configuration. Because just starting with the $1 trillion makes it all seem unreasonable and makes it all seem like, well, let's just cut this thing. There's a bunch of waste. I just like starting at a practical mission level and then getting into cost and then getting into reform, which I think leads to a better faith conversation. But Max, this has been really great. I so appreciate you coming on the show and hope the rest of your tour goes well.
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting conversation. Really enjoyed it.